In times of old, when nature in her glad excess brought forth such living marvels as no more are seen, I should have loved to dwell with the young giantess, like a voluptuous cat about the feet of a queen, to run and laugh beside her in her terrible games, and see her grow each day to a more fearful size, and see the flowering of her soul and the first flames of passionate longing in the misty depths of her eyes, to scale the slopes of her huge knees, explore at will the hollows and the heights of her, and when oppressed by the long afternoons of summer, cloudless and still, she would stretch out across the countryside to rest. I should have loved to sleep in the shadow of her breast, quietly as a village nestling under a hill. Now, I've just read out to you a poem titled The Giantess. It's a verse that exhibits the yearning for unconventional beauty, an innate desire for escape, and the comfort of submission to maternal care through an imaginative lens. Or a macrophilic fetish poem if you'd prefer the simple definition. I mean, it's literally called The Giantess. So, you can thank the one and only Charles Baudelaire for this lovely verse. And if you've never heard of him, he's a pretty popular French poet from the 1800s. He's most famous for his collection of poems titled Les Fleurs du Mal, or The Flowers of Evil in English, influencing the likes of a generation of poets such as Arthur Rimbaud, his toxic boyfriend Paul Verlaine, and even Stephen Mallarmé. I'm sincerely sorry to all of my viewers, I'm not really good at pronouncing French words. Baudelaire's poems are often dark, gritty, and morally questionable, yet others are uniquely gorgeous and actually fascinatingly capture accurate observations of real life. In the 1800s, the reception of his work was often very mixed, and still to this day, the reviews are very polarizing. People either think he's the best poet in the world, or absolutely despise him and literally everything that he wrote. In fact, the release of The Flowers of Evil back in 1857 was so controversial that it got him and everyone involved prosecuted in court, resulting in 6 of the 100 poems in The Flowers of Evil being removed due to its content, and himself with a 300 franc fine. And I know what's going on in your head. You're probably thinking to yourself, what is so damn controversial about these actual poems? And to that I say, just wait, you'll find out. I promise. Because the only thing more shockingly bizarre than Charles Baudelaire's poems is the life of Charles Baudelaire. Just take my word, okay? Once you know everything there is to know about the guy, it's all gonna make much more sense later on. So, starting off with a bang, when Charles Baudelaire was just 5 years old, his father had passed away, and his mother, Caroline Baudelaire, remarried quite quickly. Like the next year, kinda quick. To a man named Lieutenant Colonel Jack Orpik. As you can imagine, to any 5-year-old, this was absolutely devastating, especially as Charles had just spent an extremely close 18 months with his mother on the outskirts of Paris. These guys were close, okay? So he took this remarriage as a complete betrayal. It's widely recognized here that this crucial realization for Charles that he was no longer the main focus of his mother's affection is the stem for quite a lot of trauma that comes later on in his life. And I feel like it's necessary here that I give you a bit of a warning, okay? As his relationship with his mother wasn't really the normal kind. When I say this man was insanely attached to his mother, I'm not using that lightly. It's okay if you don't believe me now, okay? You're gonna believe by the end of the video. Let me just give you a little taste, okay? For example, he once wrote to his mother in a letter, "There was in my childhood a period of passionate love for you." You know, just normal things you say to your mum. What's so weird about that? And you know that jock guy that I was talking about earlier, aka the new stepfather? Well, they both quickly became rivals. Charles even went on to call him, and I quote, a dominant and oppressive figure. Jacques was an authoritarian. He was socially ambitious, strict, and conventional, a complete opposite to Baudelaire's life. One that is artistic and literary indulgent, one that was brought to him by his actual biological father. So you can imagine this clash resulted in pure hatred. Now, for his education, Baudelaire attended Lycée Louis le Grand. I think I pronounced that right. To study law, which was a degree people back in that time would study if they really had no idea what they were gonna do for a career. It's like if you were to study like business nowadays. It's a pretty broad degree. Now his studying was pretty erratic, and Spoiler alert, it's even what got him expelled. So he was a naughty boy, okay? Very naughty Charles. More importantly though, this period was where he found his addiction to the two big things that always seem to claim the minds of unhinged celebrities: prostitutes and drugs. And it was even recorded that this is probably the time where he contracted either gonorrhea or syphilis. Spoiler alert again, is what killed him in the end. Unfortunately, poor Charles was caught in a time period where protection wasn't really accessible or cheap. During this time period, he was also spending all of his money on clothes. And I'm not kidding when I say all of his money. This guy could not budget if it saved his life. Third spoiler, it did not save his life. 1839 came around and Baudelaire finally achieved his degree, and it was the wish of his father that he would direct his career towards something law or diplomacy related. You know, probably because that's what the guy studied, right? But like any rebellious teen, who's gonna listen to their stepfather anyway? The unstoppable force known as Charles Baudelaire decided to take on literature as a career choice. And you know what? Good for Charles, okay? It's probably the best decision he ever made. There's nothing wrong with wanting to direct your career towards something you actually want to do. But as you can imagine, this did not please his parents in the slightest. The craziest thing about this too is his mother said in retaliation to this, and I quote, "Oh, what grief! If Charles had let himself be guided by his stepfather, his career would have been very different. He would not have left a name in literature, it is true, but we should have been happier, all three of us." This is next level family trauma. So, in a very calm, calculated, and reasonable way to react to your stepchild wanting to chase his dreams, evil stepdad Jacques shipped Baudelaire off to India. No, I'm not kidding. It was this voyage to Calcutta, India that he hoped to curb Baudelaire's dissolute lifestyle. I don't know, maybe knock the fun out of him. But luckily for Baudelaire, there was an extreme storm and the ship shipwrecked, where he spent 2 months in Mauritius and Reunion instead. Ultimately, Baudelaire never continued on to India. In fact, he refused to continue on to India and would only sail back to Paris instead. Take that, stepdad. So, he returns back to Paris and he actually starts to write a lot of the earlier poems in The Flowers of Evil during this period. This was probably his most diligent period, always writing, never letting himself be distracted by sensual desires, and even making surprisingly good financial decisions. Nah, I'm just kidding. He spent all of his money. I'm not kidding when I say he spent all of his money. When Charles was 21, he received a sizable inheritance from his late father's passing. I think it was about 100,000 francs, which in terrible currency conversions, it's somewhere around 14 million USD. I kid you not. This guy blew half of that in 2 years. $7 million in 2 years. What was this guy even spending it on? I'd like to believe that if Baudelaire was alive in present time in our insanely consumeristic world, he'd probably be walking around with a Birkin covered in Labubus. Well, if he can spend $7 million, he'd probably have a few of them. His spending problem was so bad that his evil stepdad had to jump in and go to court and have a trustee appointed to manage his fortune and provide him an allowance. Well, I should say a limit. This guy had to be limited on what he could spend. And as you can imagine, Baudelaire hated this terribly. He even went on to argue that allowing him to fail financially would have been the one sure way of teaching him to keep his finances in order. Please, Mum, let me spend all my money and go bankrupt. Only then will I learn my consequences. Trust me. You're starting to understand how strange this guy was. As if it wasn't obvious enough to you by now, this guy had definitely earned the dandy title. A man who places particular importance upon physical appearance and personal grooming, refined language, and leisurely hobbies. In his case, the kind that makes you rack up debt and spend way more than you actually have. What I find really funny about this period is that it was recorded to escape creditors. Charles Baudelaire would literally jump from residence to residence. He was literally running away from financial debt by moving houses, just as much as he could. Which is a method so stupid. I don't know how that would have worked. Maybe Charles is just a genius. During this time, he also met a woman named Joan de Vaux, who was a French-born actress of Caribbean descent. And she quickly became Charles's mistress for the next 20 years. She was a major inspiration for a great deal of Baudelaire's poetry. Thanks to her, we get one of like my favorite comparisons in all of Baudelaire's poetry, where he refers to her lazy head as a young elephant. This isn't really important to the story, but I just wanted to mention it because it's really cute. Obviously, she wasn't the only woman in his life, as Charles did have other mistresses. And his mum, who hated Jean's guts, by the way, titling her as someone who tortured him in every way and drained him of money at every opportunity. I don't think Charles took this lightly. Now, besides prostitutes and fancy clothes, the other main drain of Baudelaire's money was drugs and alcohol. He would experiment using hashish at the Club de Hashishins. Did they intend for that name to be such a tongue twister? It was basically like a circle of artists, a club that would experiment the side effects of cannabis on their own work. I'm talking Victor Hugo, Alexandre Dumas, Balzac. These guys were getting high, and instead of being normal and, relaxing or anything, they were doing work. What nerds? Throughout his life, Baudelaire would also habitually use laudanum, which was an opium-based medicine prescribed for treating physical and psychological suffering. Whether Charles was taking it for his syphilis or his depression, it was prolific. And you know what I find ironic about all of this was that in 1860, he actually wrote a book called Artificial Paradises, talking about the state of being under opium and hashish and all of that. There's a point in this book where he writes, "He who would resort to a poison in order to think would soon be incapable of thinking without the poison." You guys will never believe what eventually happens. Bet you got zero idea, don't you? Now, addition to the hashish and the opium, Baudelaire was also a heavy drinker. In fact, alcohol inspired a lot of his poems. There's even a spot in The Flowers of Evil literally called Wine, but we'll get into more of that later. My favorite poem that is inspired by alcohol from Charles Baudelaire is titled Be Drunk. The opening line reads, "You have to always be drunk. That's all there is to it, it's the only way. So as not to feel the horrible burden of time that breaks your back and bends you to the earth. You have to be continually drunk." Now I'd ask who hurt this guy, but I think I've studied enough about him to know it's somewhere in between his stepdad and his mum. Or both. Now, as you can imagine, money was pretty tight for someone who loved women, clothes, and narcotics a little too much, especially when you've spent all of your life savings already. Luckily for Baudelaire, in 1847, he discovered the work of Edgar Allan Poe, and in seeing extreme similarities to his work and Poe's, he took on the role of transcribing his work into French, which was actually a good source of regular income and occupation for the rest of his life. Around 1848, the French Revolution happened, and you can bet your boy Charles took place in it, even writing for a revolutionary newspaper at the time. It was widely confirmed too that he took place in the actual riots that overthrew King Louis Philippe. And look, I know that this is an unconfirmed account, so please take this with a grain of salt, okay? We don't know if it actually happened, but I would love to believe it did. But it was rumored that Charles Baudelaire, in the heat of the moment, brandished a weapon and encouraged insurgents around him to go shoot General Orpik. Guys, I know we're trying to overthrow the government here, but trust me, we need to go kill my dad. This guy hated his stepdad with such a burning passion. I truly have not been hating to my full potential. I didn't know you could get this bad. In 1857, 10 years later, The Flowers of Evil was released. And we will get into it later, I promise. But a very important part about this year was it's the year that his stepfather passed away. Did anyone hear that? I think I just heard the ghost of Charles Baudelaire cheer. Him and his mother had a pretty shaky relationship at this point, but the death of Orpik almost brought them together, in a way. Sure, his mum probably thought of him as a big embarrassment, but they were talking again. And that was really important for Baudelaire. He even wrote to her, get ready. Believe that I belong to you absolutely, and that I belong only to you. Again, not a letter to a lover, a letter to his mother. In the years following The Flowers of Evil, Baudelaire worked on his reviews, essays, and translations. But his illnesses, long-term use of opium, clearly stressful life, and his self-inflicted poverty had taken a toll on him. He wasn't aging the best at this point. Great news for Charles though, as his mother had finally relented and let him stay with her at a seaside town in France called Honfleur. Now trust me, I'm not gonna shame the guy for gonna go live with his mother, especially if he's down on his luck, okay? If you have the opportunity to go live with your parents, it's free. But if you have ever dated a guy and thought, oh my gosh, this guy is such a mama's boy, you've never dated Charles Baudelaire. And it can get so much worse. A few years later, in 1864, he actually moved to Belgium in hopes to sell his work rights and even give off lectures. But during this, his drinking habits and his opium indulgence almost seemed to flow in excess. Unfortunately, 2 years later, Charles Baudelaire suffered from a stroke which resulted in paralysis. The last year of Charles Baudelaire's life was spent in that semi-paralyzed state, and he passed away a year later in 1867. Now, maybe you knew all this already, or you're just learning about it for the first time, but wherever you are at, I think we have to admit Charles Baudelaire's life was an extreme tragedy. Sure, there may have been a few bad decisions in there, well, maybe a few bad decisions in there, but one could also argue there are a few actions that were quite out of his control. I have to cut this guy a little bit of slack too, because if anyone's entire life was summed up in a YouTube video like this, it probably wouldn't look as great either. Obviously, not everyone has the same opinion as I do, because art is subjective, but I honestly do believe that Charles Baudelaire was an extremely talented poet. He wrote intricately, influenced many, and has some of what I believe are the best poems in history. When I first read The Flowers of Evil, there was a poem titled The Revenant, or The Ghost, depending on your translation, and it stuck to me ever since the day I read it. Like angels with bright savage eyes, I will come treading phantom-wise, hither where thou art wont to sleep, amid the shadows hollow and deep. And I will give thee, my dark one, kisses as icy as the moon, caresses as of snakes that crawl in circles round a cistern's wall. When morning shows its livid face, there will be no one in my place, and a strange cold will settle here. Others, not knowing what thou art, may think to rain upon thy heart. With tenderness, I trust to fear. Something about the mix of romantic yearning and ghost-like horror makes this poem eerily attractive to me. Kisses as icy as the moon, caressing like a snake, and how much punch does that opening line, like angels with bright savage eyes, have? I don't understand French myself, and all I can read are varied interpretations and English translations of his work. But it doesn't matter which translation you read, it's clearly apparent between all of them that only someone extremely tormented with life could have written it. And I speak from experience as a writer myself when I say that everything you write pretty much is bits and fragments of your own life or experiences, no matter how much you try to remove yourself from it. I don't believe that The Flowers of Evil could have been written without everything that happened to Charles Baudelaire, which is why it's important to know where he came from. So let's do it. Let's finally take a look at The Flowers of Evil, split into 6 thematic sections: spleen and ideal, Parisian scenes, wine, flowers of evil, revolt, and death. The first category was spleen and ideal, aka the core of the book, which includes poems swinging between ideal, meaning the yearn for beauty, love, art, and spirituality, to spleen, meaning crushing boredom, despair, and self-loathing. Spleen was a keyword that Baudelaire had coined himself, and one you'll see quite a lot throughout The Flowers of Evil. It comes from medieval humorism, where it was believed that black bile, which is a cold, dry, and dark fluid that caused depression, was believed to come from the spleen. When Baudelaire talks about the spleen in his poems, he's not actually mentioning the organ, but instead he's using that term to express fear, profound melancholy, existential dread, and a disgust with life. It's all very emo and very Baudelaire, isn't it? Now, this comparison between spleen and ideal was extremely prolific throughout The Flowers of Evil, and I think the best way to explain this is in his poem titled A Carcass. It's quite long, and we've got a lot of things to get through, so I'm not going to read the entire thing out to you, but I do want to summarize it because it can't be missed. This lovely poem tells a story of when a man was recalling to his lover about the time they went for a lovely walk in the park, and what was that? Oh, they saw a foul, burning, and swollen carcass on the ground. In great detail, might I add. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, there is no way that Baudelaire can top something so charming, so affectionate as this. It simply cannot be done, can it? Well, what if I told you that our tender-hearted protagonist then proceeds to tell his lover that she too will one day be like this burning carcass? I can't handle it. The tears, they won't stop flowing. I'm not kidding, by the way. Please read this with me. And yet you will be like this corruption, like this horrible infection. Star of my eyes, sunlight of my being, you, my angel and my passion. Oh, Baudelaire, you really know the way to a woman's heart, don't you? The second category is Parisian scenes, and it features a bunch of poems that observe Paris in the 1800s, featuring a range of themes such as the alienization and even the beauty of the modernized city, tons of its outcasts, and an emergence of its modern urban life within itself, often blending the fantastic with a pretty harsh reality. Thirdly, we have the category called wine as an escape from time, misery, and even life itself. Isn't that very Baudelaire? The fourth category is called the flowers of evil, and this one is erotically obsessed. It's also obscene, graphic, and morally questionable. This is the part that features the majority of banned poems in the Flowers of Evil. For example, there's a poem in here called A Martyr, which sets the scene of a bleeding out headless corpse in a very luxurious and opulent room. It's a very violent scene, of course, that in the end suggests her lover had actually killed her because she couldn't satisfy his immense desire and in turn turned her into a martyr to his lust. You should read it for yourself, but it's everything that we explained earlier. It's erotically obsessed, it's graphic, gross, morally questionable. Well, actually, now that I think about it, it's murder. So I don't know if we should be morally questioning that. We should know that's bad. The fifth category is called Revolt. A very short category, but not lacking in any extremity, let me tell you that. This showcases Baudelaire's edgy humor with blasphemy, satanic imagery, and a general defiance to God as a whole. He has a poem here called The Litanies of Satan, which is formed like a standard Catholic prayer, but instead inverted towards, well, Satan. And you know, you read poems like these and it makes you wonder, how did this not too get banned back in the day? Like, it was the 1800s, for Christ's sakes. Wasn't everyone religious and extremely scared of satanic themes? I was born in the early 2000s, okay? I wasn't allowed to read Harry Potter as a kid because my parents thought it was witchcraft. That may be an original experience though. The last category is called Death. A pretty dark finish to the collection, but not unsuspected from the edgelord known as Charles Baudelaire, is it? I think the best way to sum this category up is with the poem called The Death of the Poor, which reads the following. It's death that comforts us, alas, and makes us live. It is the goal of life. It is the only hope, which, like an elixir, makes us inebriate and gives us the courage to march until evening. This poem presents death as the only true refuge left for the poor, something that might hit a little too close to home for Charles. Now, it's probably pretty clear to you at this point that Baudelaire was playing with the themes of sex and death pretty frequently throughout all of his poems. Two extremely scandalous themes for its time. Not to mention all the other themes he was talking about, such as lesbianism, the corruption of Paris, a general oppression to living, and even mentioning drugs. I've already told you, so you know by now, that an obscenity trial was taken against the Flowers of Evil. Himself, his publisher, and his printer were fined for this, but not imprisoned. Woo! I think the ghost is back. I'm really scared. And as we talked about earlier, 6 of his poems were censored. But what was actually in these poems, and was it even worth being banned? Let's find out. Now, the first two banned poems were titled Lesbos and Damned Woman, which, as you can probably tell by its title, they were banned for using lesbian themes. They follow the topic of ancient Grecian goddesses and even the poet Sappho. If we're talking in Baudelaire terms, these poems aren't really hypersexual. They're actually pretty tame. But these poems almost fetishize the theme of lesbianism with excessive objectification. I want to bury my head in your deep bosom and find in your breast the cool of the tomb. This is just a random excerpt, but you get the point, okay? I obviously don't agree with the real reason that these poems were banned, but it's not like a real lesbian poet was like writing these and being censored. It's just our buddy Charles. The earth is still gonna keep spinning without his input on marginalized groups. Also, I just want to point out that The Flowers of Evil was almost called Les Lesbiennes, or The Lesbians in English, before his friend Hippolyte Babau. What a wicked name, that Hippolyte Babau? Before his friend suggested The Flowers of Evil. Can you imagine if his book was actually called The Lesbians? The whole book would have probably just been banned. Now, also banned for similar reasons is the poem called The Vampire Metamorphoses, which this time features those same lesbians, but they're vampires now. I will admit though, this poem is actually really sexual, just like the other poem titled The Jewels, banned for similar themes that we don't need to get into. What I find surprising is the poem titled A Girl Too Gay is not banned for lesbian themes, because it uses the term gay quite literally. But instead, it was banned due to its sadism. Now, if you don't like Baudelaire, it might be because of this poem, and honestly, I do not blame you, okay? The main theme about this poem is punishing female happiness, eroticizing the wounding of a woman, and all the graphic imagination that comes with it. It's an extremely nasty poem, to say the least. The last banned poem is titled Lef, portraying erotic desire as a distraction from conscience, and using the act of fornicating as an avoidance to punishment or apology. This poem was banned due to it almost seeming like it was glorifying these instead of it being a temptation that needed to be resisted. Obviously, our buddy Baudelaire decided to fight these censorships in court, and he even offered 3 reasons as to why he believed that they shouldn't be banned. Firstly, he said that when writing these poems, he offered them as repellent and not attractive. Sure, buddy. Secondly, he said these poems were less shocking when read in the whole context of The Flowers of Evil instead of being singled out in court like this. Which, you know what, to an extent I have to agree. I don't agree with some of the content in these poems, but there are definitely other poems that maybe should have been brought up as well. And lastly, which is my personal favorite, he says that other writers have gotten away with much worse. It's just like a little kid complaining to his mum that his brother didn't get a punishment too. I can't blame him, I can't. Now, for this time, censorship wasn't all that uncommon, and often obscenity trials would take place. For example, the French author Gustave Flaubert wrote a book in 1857 titled Madame Bovary, which is a pretty solid read, that put him on trial because his main character was a bored housewife who had illicit affairs and pretty critical views on religion, which is just like any romance novel nowadays. They were banning poems over nothing, okay? Why did the litanies of Satan get a scot-free pass? Now, interesting enough, Flaubert actually wrote to Baudelaire after reading some of his poems. You have found a way to rejuvenate romanticism. You are as unyielding as marble and as penetrating as an English mist. Isn't that a pretty romantic thing to write to someone? Is it just me or am I sensing tension here? Brothers in crime, I guess? It's apparent by now that Baudelaire's poetry can often be pretty confronting to read, especially if you have no knowledge on who he is or what even may have influenced such topics. I remember being recommended The Flowers of Evil on a trip in Paris, and I knew nothing about this guy at all. I picked up a copy and I was quickly engrossed by its content. Simply, I was fascinated. You know, some poems I found beautiful, some poems I found gross and disgusting, and if I'm being truly honest, a lot of them I did find downright embarrassing, which I'd never really experienced reading classical literature. I mean, the guy writes about women as if they are a disease he can't help but catch. Like he's some helpless victim to prostitutes, despite him being being the ones seeking them out. There's a poem he wrote in The Flowers of Evil called "You'd Take the Entire Universe to Bed with You." Is that not the craziest insult you've ever heard? The poem vividly accuses a so-called impure woman of cruel and insatiable lust. There's another poem called Sed Non Satiata, where he depicts the idea of a woman as a demonic creature that scorches him with flames. As you can tell, there's really not a lot of respect for the opposite gender in The Flowers of Evil. Eugene Crepet, a biographer for Baudelaire, writes, "Deep down, Baudelaire despised women. As a dandy, he loathed them. As a Catholic, he saw in them a seductive form of the devil." Like, come on, Baudelaire, you're a grown man. You can resist these so-called temptations. No need to be all misogynistic about it. And I mean, that's really the main issue with The Flowers of Evil, his copious misogyny. Something that a lot of people can't get over while reading The Flowers of Evil. In 1935, a French women's magazine titled Dimanche de la Femme, or Women's Sundays, published a piece on the type of men to avoid. And yeah, you'll never guess who the author of this piece, Martine, used as a key example to steer completely clear from. She claims that Baudelaire only believed women to be revolting because they were natural, as opposed to the preferred male dandy who was all artificial, aka himself, writing that men like Baudelaire only have a basic grasp on the psychology of a female heart. And I mean, Baudelaire himself, for The Flowers of Evil, writes, "This book was not written for my women, my daughters, or my sisters." Yeah, Charles, your poems about alcoholic husbands murdering their wives are too complex for the average female mind, right? How on earth could they even begin to understand the literary skill that is, "My wife is dead and I am free. Now I can drink both night and day. And when I came home without my pay, her crying upset me horribly." I'm so sorry to all the female viewers. Apparently that was only for the boys. Charles said so. When I first came across this work and all of its problems, I needed to know where all this hate came from. I didn't even know anything there is to know about Baudelaire, which is why I felt it was important to explain to you a bit earlier about everything that influenced The Flowers of Evil, everything about Baudelaire. I mean, everything in his poems make a little more sense once you understand the narcotics he was having and even the relationship with women that he had. But it's important that we as readers understand that this is just evidence as to why such themes were explored in his work, and certainly not an excuse for it. Charles Baudelaire had a hard, depressing, and destructive life. But it doesn't mean that he gets a scot-free pass to write anything he wants without criticism. It's 2026 now, times have changed. And he's also dead, so whatever I say he can't argue with. Let's quickly take a look at the poem titled Destruction, which I think perfectly describes Baudelaire's life. "Ceaselessly beside me the demon rives. He swarms around me like impalpable air. I swallow him and feel him burning my lungs and filling them with an everlasting guilty desire. At times he takes, knowing my great love for art, the form of the most seductive of women, and under specious pretext of depression, accustoms my lips to infamous love charms. Thus, far from the sight of God, he leads me, panting and crushed by fatigue, into the midst of the plains of boredom, extensive and deserted, and throws before my eyes, full of confusion, soiled clothing, open wounds, and the bloody apparatus of destruction." Baudelaire's life was terrible, but it's almost one that he embraced. Whether you argue it was influenced from trauma or even the narcotics he was taking, he often went about life as if things were happening to him and not because of him. In this poem, the blame of his destructive life isn't his fault. It's the so-called demon that swarms himself and fills his lungs with desire. We even get that perfect example of how women and their seductiveness just distract him from his art, as if he's some helpless being who can't say no. When you take all of this in, as well as his obsessiveness with wanting to make him look like a certain way and becoming this dandy who goes into financial ruin, it's clear that Charles Baudelaire showed a lot of signs of being a narcissist. But you probably already figured that one out, didn't you? With all that being said though, if you like The Flowers of Evil, I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with indulging in art that you don't agree with, and even reading art with a critical flair. I think it's actually healthy to do that. Rosemary Lloyd, a biographer for Charles Baudelaire, writes, "From my first encounter with him in Paris sometime in the spring of 1968, Baudelaire has been a constant revelation and an enduring challenge. A revelation of the intensity of sensual experience through his poetry and of the power of intellectual exploration in his responses to art, literature, and music. A challenge in his injunctions to women to be silent, his misogynistic journal jottings, and his apparent conviction of the one-sidedness and transitory nature of love. But it never occurred to me that as a feminist, I could just set him aside, refuse to read him, and explore him because of his vision on women. Which any case I have always seen as too complex, too intensely personal, merely to be categorized under that all-too-easy label of misogyny. Of course feminists should read Baudelaire. We're surely not going to allow our beliefs to box us into a tiny world where we explore only those things that reflect our own position, are we? If we do, how do we differ from the sexist, racist, ignorant minds we so deplore? At times, reading Charles Baudelaire can be really fun, but it can also be a challenge. But even then, isn't that kind of fun? Reading literature that challenges you, makes you think, or even be so bizarrely wrong that it just reinforces your own beliefs. If you want my honest opinion, I am truly fascinated by Charles Baudelaire's life and the art that he produced. When I read The Flowers of Evil, I can't help but take the role of an observer, just like Charles Baudelaire liked to do himself. Except instead of taking in Paris and all of his surroundings, I'm taking in his insanely comical life and the strangest literary pieces that I think I'm ever gonna read. There are similar poets, and he did influence many, but I don't think there's ever gonna be another Charles Baudelaire. Now, with all that being said, my video does come to an end, my first one, so thank you for sticking around all the way to the end. Hopefully I didn't put you to sleep at all. If you enjoyed this, please let me know down below in the comments. I had so much fun making this, and I really do want to make more, so if you want to see more, subscribe and like, if people still ask for that anyway. Thank you so much, and have a good rest of your day.